On a barren hill in southern Turkey, the wind moves across the stones like it remembers. The landscape seems empty at first, dry grass, scattered rocks, the silence of a place that has seen too much time, until you notice the pillars rising from the dust. Each stands taller than a man, carved into perfect T shapes, their surfaces etched with animals that no longer live in this land: foxes, vultures, snakes, wild boars. They stare from the limestone as if still guarding something ancient. This is Göbekli Tepe, a name that means pot-belly hill. For thousands of years the world above it was farmland and dust. Beneath, untouched and forgotten, lay the oldest known monument on earth. When archaeologists first uncovered it in the 1990s, they believed it must be a medieval graveyard. The stones were too large, too precise, too deliberate to belong to the Stone Age. Yet carbon dating told another story. These pillars were erected around 9600 BCE, 7,000 years before the pyramids, thousands before agriculture, before pottery, before written language. Nothing in the accepted timeline allowed for such a place. Hunter-gatherers were supposed to live in small groups, always moving, without the knowledge or resources to build on this scale. They were supposed to wander, not construct. They were supposed to survive, not sculpt. And yet, someone, somehow, had raised these pillars, each weighing up to 16 tons, arranged in perfect circles. Every ring of stone was aligned with the sky, positioned to capture sunlight and starlight in ways no random construction could achieve. Whoever did this understood balance, geometry, and purpose that should not have existed 10,000 years before civilization began. At the center of each ring stood two taller pillars, facing each other like guardians. Their surfaces carried faint carvings of human arms and belts, suggesting that the stones themselves represented people, perhaps ancestors or deities carved into the earth. Around them, smaller pillars formed rings, each decorated with animals that may have symbolized tribes, seasons, or constellations. The purpose remains unknown, but the message is unmistakable. This was a place of gathering, of ceremony, of shared belief. What startled archaeologists most was what they didn't find: no houses, no signs of permanent settlement, no tools of farming or storage. Whoever built this temple did not live beside it. They journeyed here, worked together to raise the stones, performed rituals, and then left. To organize such labor, to feed and coordinate hundreds of people, required planning far beyond what was thought possible for hunter-gatherers. In single excavation, Göbekli Tepe rewrote the story of humanity's beginnings. For centuries, historians had believed that agriculture came first, that once humans learned to farm, they built villages, temples, and religion. Göbekli Tepe turned that order upside down. Here was proof that people might have first come together for belief, not for food. It suggested that faith, not necessity, built civilization. Religion may have inspired agriculture, not the other way around. Humanity's first monuments were not storehouses or shelters, but shrines. And then, just as mysteriously, they buried it. Layer by layer, the people of Göbekli Tepe filled their own temples with rubble, sealing each circle beneath tons of earth. When modern archaeologists found it, the site was perfectly preserved, as if someone had deliberately hidden it from time. The soil around the pillars contained tools, animal bones, and traces of immense feasts, yet no signs of battle, no invader, no fire. It was not destroyed, it was entombed. Why? That question has haunted every researcher since. Some believe it was climate, that drought or famine ended their gatherings. Others think it was spiritual, that they buried their sacred place as an act of reverence or fear or prophecy. Perhaps the people who built Göbekli Tepe knew their world was ending and sealed their temple as an offering to eternity. The carvings might hold clues. Across the pillars, certain symbols repeat: vultures carrying spears, serpents coiling beside half circles, scorpions beneath stars. To the untrained eye, they seem decorative. To some researchers, they form a coded message. In 2017, astronomers suggested that the carvings on one pillar represent a cosmic event, a comet strike that may have ended the Ice Age around 10,900 BCE. If true, Göbekli Tepe could be both temple and observatory, a memorial to the day the heavens burned. Even the architecture supports that idea. The circles are aligned with constellations visible in the northern sky at the end of the Ice Age. Each layer shows a subtle shift in orientation, as if the builders tracked the slow movement of the stars, something that takes thousands of years to notice. For them to measure it, they must have inherited the knowledge from an even older tradition. Today, less than 10% of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar reveals hundreds more buried enclosures beneath the hill, each a potential new chapter in the same lost story. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the region, other mounds, Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, Sefer Tepe, share the same design, the same carvings, the same unfathomable age. It no longer looks like an isolated miracle. It looks like a network, a culture stretching across hundreds of miles, united by shared symbols and purpose. A civilization that rose before history and vanished before it could write its name. If these people truly lived 12,000 years ago, they were closer in time to the end of the Ice Age than to the building of the pyramids. They lived in a world still healing from glaciers, when the first forests were returning to the Middle East and the seas were still rising. And yet, amid that chaos, they gathered, carved, and built something timeless, a monument not to power, but to meaning. Standing among those stones today, it's impossible not to feel the echo of their intent. These were not crude beginnings, they were memories, perhaps the last light of an older flame. The people of Göbekli Tepe were not the first to dream of permanence. They were the last to remember what permanence meant. Who built Göbekli Tepe? That question has haunted every archaeologist who stood beneath its pillars. The simplest answer is also the strangest one. No one knows. The builders left no written record, no burials, no artifacts that reveal who they were. Their tools were made of flint and obsidian, primitive by our standards, yet capable of cutting and shaping limestone with astonishing precision. The stones they carved weigh up to 16 tons each, and some were transported from a quarry nearly half a kilometer away. Without beasts of burden or wheels, that task would seem impossible. But they did it again and again for centuries. Archaeologists have reconstructed possible methods, rolling the stones on logs, dragging them with ropes, or levering them inch by inch. But the more one studies the site, the harder it is to accept that explanation alone. The pillars are not roughly stacked boulders. They are refined, balanced, carved in high relief with lifelike animals. Their builders were artists as much as engineers. Whoever they were organized. A project of this scale required leadership, planning, and cooperation among hundreds of people. In a world without villages or farms, where food had to be hunted and gathered, That meant coordination on a level unseen elsewhere in prehistory. To sustain the workers, large feasts must have been held. Archaeologists found thousands of animal bones, from gazelles, wild cattle, and even aurochs, suggesting the community came together for massive ritual gatherings. This was not casual work, it was ceremony through creation. But who directed it? Was there a priesthood, a council of elders, or did belief itself bind them, a vision shared so strongly that it pulled entire tribes together? Some researchers believe Göbekli Tepe was the epicenter of an early spiritual revolution, the birth of organized religion. Before nations, before kings, before writing, there was faith. And here, on this windswept hill, people learned to express it in stone. Others see something even deeper. They suggest Göbekli Tepe marks the end of an older world, the last effort of a culture already fading. To them, the builders were survivors of the cataclysm that ended the Ice Age, refugees from a lost civilization that brought memory of the stars, the tools of geometry, and the idea of the sacred. Perhaps they carried fragments of an earlier knowledge, not machines or metals, but an understanding of how to shape the world through unity and purpose. That idea remains controversial, but the evidence is stubborn. The earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe are the most advanced. Later enclosures are smaller, less precise, as if the people's skill diminished over generations. Usually civilizations evolve upward, learning, refining, perfecting. Yet here we see the opposite. The oldest structures are the grandest. What kind of culture begins at its peak and declines over time? It suggests the builders inherited something they no longer fully understood. They built in imitation of their ancestors, preserving rituals whose meanings were fading. The pillars became symbols of memory, repeating forms that once held power but whose origin was already distant. The people of Göbekli Tepe were not inventing, they were remembering. As the centuries passed, the climate around them changed. The green hills of southern Anatolia began to dry. Herds moved on, rivers shifted. The gatherings became less frequent, the feasts smaller. Slowly, the great circles fell silent. Yet before abandoning their temple, the builders performed one final act. They buried it, not carelessly but deliberately, filling each enclosure with rubble and soil. They preserved their creation for a future they could never see. No one knows why. Perhaps they believed the earth itself was sacred, that to return the stones to the ground was to complete a cycle. Or perhaps it was protection, an attempt to guard the site from desecration. Another theory suggests fear. Maybe they thought something lived among the stones, something not meant to be left in the open. When ancient people sealed their sacred places, it was often because they believed the boundary between worlds had grown too thin. Whatever their reason, their work succeeded. For nearly 12,000 years, Göbekli Tepe lay hidden beneath the soil, untouched by conquest or time. Only in the late 20th century did a shepherd stumble upon a strange carved stone, half buried in the earth, the first whisper of the forgotten temple. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in 1994, he realized instantly that it was no ordinary site. He recognized the same limestone pillars he'd seen at Neolithic ruins miles away, but here they were far older. Excavation revealed concentric circles, each older than the last. Schmidt knew what he was looking at long before the scientific community accepted it. The earliest temple built by human hands. He called it the first cathedral on earth. His discovery was met with disbelief. Many archaeologists argued it was impossible, that the people of that time lacked the means, the reason, or the social complexity to create such monuments. But the evidence was undeniable. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the impossible age. Animal bones, flint tools, and charcoal fragments all told the same story. Göbekli Tepe stood not on the threshold of civilization, but far beyond it. In 2014, Klaus Schmidt died suddenly while visiting the site that had become his life's work. He did not live to see its global recognition, nor the deeper excavations now underway. But his discovery changed everything. It forced scholars to reconsider the very definition of civilization, not as the result of farming or cities, but as a state of mind, a shared belief that meaning could be carved into the world, that stone could hold memory. Today, researchers continue to debate what Göbekli Tepe truly was. Some see it as a temple complex, others as an astronomical observatory, a social hub, or even a calendar marking the cycles of the heavens. What no one disputes is that it was built by people far more advanced, intellectually, artistically, and spiritually, than anyone imagined for their time. The more we uncover, the more Göbekli Tepe feels less like a beginning and more like an echo, the last breath of an age now lost to myth. The people who raised those stones were not primitive. They were the inheritors of a memory we've forgotten. Their work stands as proof that civilization may rise, fall, and rise again, each time convinced it was the first. When we look at Göbekli Tepe today, it is hard not to sense that every carving, every pillar, every shadow cast by the rising sun carried meaning. The people who built it had no written language, yet they spoke fluently through symbol and shape. To them, stone was memory. Each surface was a page, each animal a word in a language now forgotten. Across the site, the same creatures appear again and again: vultures, serpents, foxes, scorpions, cranes. They were not decorations, they were the alphabet of a worldview in which nature and spirit were inseparable. The vulture, in particular, dominates the imagery. In many ancient cultures that followed, vultures represented transition, the carriers of souls between earth and sky. Long before the pyramids, these people already imagined an afterlife written in the flight of birds. Some archaeologists suggest the carvings formed a kind of early star chart. One pillar, known as the vulture stone, shows a circle above a winged shape next to scorpions and abstract lines. Astronomers studying it found that the pattern matches the night sky as it appeared around 10,950 BCE. When the constellation Scorpio rose on the horizon, they believe the circle represents a comet or celestial body, perhaps even the impact event that ended the Ice Age. If that is true, Göbekli Tepe was not only a temple, but also a cosmic archive, a monument built to remember the day the heavens changed. The site's design supports that idea. Each ring of pillars is aligned differently, as if marking the slow drift of the stars over centuries. The builders could have tracked the precession of the equinoxes, an astronomical cycle taking nearly 26,000 years to complete. To notice such movement requires generations of observation. It would mean that the people of Göbekli Tepe inherited knowledge from ancestors who had already watched the sky for millennia. But there is another layer of mystery: the human forms carved into the two central pillars of each circle. They have arms, belts, and hands, but no faces. Perhaps they were gods, perhaps ancestors, perhaps ideals. the unseen forces that shape life. Whatever they represented, they stand at the center of every enclosure, the still points around which all other stones revolve. To step inside would have been to stand between worlds, the earthly circle of the tribe and the eternal circle of the heavens. If Göbekli Tepe was a temple, it was a place without walls, open to the sky. There was no altar, no throne, no sign of hierarchy. It was built not for one leader, but for everyone. In that sense, it was the opposite of later civilizations. Where later temples glorify kings and gods, Göbekli Tepe seems to glorify existence itself, the relationship between humanity, the earth, and the stars. Over time, echoes of this worldview may have spread outward. As the climate warmed and people migrated, they carried fragments of what they had learned. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built ziggurats, step temples rising toward the sky. In Egypt, the first pyramids appeared, their shapes mimicking rays of sunlight frozen in stone. In the Indus Valley, intricate city plans mirrored celestial order. Across the globe, civilizations emerged seemingly at once, all obsessed with aligning their monuments to the heavens. It is tempting to see in them the distant descendants of Göbekli Tepe's builders, remembering a truth they no longer fully understood. Even mythology seems to echo it. The concept of a sacred mountain, the axis that joins heaven and earth, appears in nearly every ancient tradition. Mount Meru in India, Mount Zion in the Near East, Olympus in Greece, the world tree of the Norse. Göbekli Tepe may have been the prototype of that idea. A man-made mountain of meaning, a place where sky and soil met. Its people turned the natural world into a map of the divine. To the modern mind, such connections feel speculative, yet the emotional resonance is undeniable. Stand among the excavated stones at dawn, when the first light slides across the carvings, and you feel the precision of intention. Nothing here was random. Each angle, each pillar's placement, each animal etched into its surface, everything was aligned to something unseen but deeply felt. It is not the work of superstition, it is the work of awe. What happened to these builders after they sealed their hill remains unknown. Some may have drifted west toward the Mediterranean, carrying seeds and memories that would blossom into early agriculture. Others may have moved east, merging with tribes along the Tigris and Euphrates. Within a few thousand years, the first known cities arose in those valleys. Their myths speak of gods descending from the mountains, of knowledge brought from the highlands of the sunrise. Perhaps those myths were not invention, but remembrance. Even in legend, we can hear their voice. The Sumerians told of the Anunnaki, divine beings who taught humanity the arts of civilization. The Egyptians credited the god Thoth with giving them writing and science. To the Greeks, it was Hermes, to the Maya, Kukulkan. Different names, the same story, a gift of knowledge from an earlier time. It may have begun with the people who carved their gods in stone and buried them under the earth. When modern visitors walk through the excavation, they often describe a feeling that is difficult to explain. It is not reverence for a particular religion, but a recognition that human beings have always sought meaning beyond survival. 12,000 years separate us from the hands that shaped these pillars, yet the questions they asked are the same. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What happens when the sky changes and the world begins again? Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was humanity's first attempt to answer those questions together. It stands at the threshold between myth and memory, between what we know and what we can only feel. Its builders may be gone, but their silence speaks louder than any scripture. They remind us that civilization did not begin with tools or trade, but with wonder, with the moment someone looked at the stars and decided they meant something. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological site, it is the first recorded thought, a thought carved in stone, buried, forgotten, and finally rediscovered, as if humanity itself had written a message to its future self: remember who you were. As the people of Göbekli Tepe gathered beneath the stars, something remarkable was taking shape. Not just a temple, but a way of seeing. For the first time in history, humanity began to map the heavens with purpose. They look upward not merely for wonder, but for understanding. The sky became their calendar, their compass, and their scripture. And in that act of watching, they changed forever what it meant to be human. Night after night, they saw patterns in the darkness, the slow wheel of constellations turning above their stone circles. To them, the sky was alive. Stars were not points of light, but beings, ancestors, and omens. Each movement had meaning, each season carried a story. As they watched, they noticed cycles, the return of the same stars every year, the shifting path of the sun, the moon's rhythm of fullness and loss. From those patterns, they learned time. From time, they learned memory, and memory became civilization. Archaeologists have found subtle clues in the placement of Göbekli Tepe's pillars, alignments with solstices and with constellations that once rose directly over the horizon. Even though no written record survives, the geometry speaks for itself. This was not guesswork, it was astronomy, a sky map carved into the earth, built by a people with no machines, no metal, no mathematics as we know them, only patience and generations of watching. They may not have called themselves astronomers, but they understood something profound. The heavens moved like a heartbeat, slow and eternal, and if you learned its rhythm, you could predict the world. When the sun reached a certain star, the rains would come. When it set behind the distant hills, the animals would migrate. To understand the sky was to survive, and to survive was to worship. Göbekli Tepe may have been the birthplace of that connection, where observation first became religion. It is no coincidence that so many early myths describe gods descending from the stars or dwelling among the constellations. Those stories are the language of the sky turned into memory. When a bright meteor burned across the horizon, they called it a messenger. When the moon vanished, they feared death. When it returned, they celebrated rebirth. The heavens were a mirror for everything they could not explain. Thousands of years later, that same impulse appeared again, at Stonehenge, at Nabta Playa in Egypt's desert, at Caral in the valleys of Peru, each built by cultures separated by oceans, yet united in their obsession with the sky. The pattern is unmistakable, circles of stone aligned with the solstice designed to track the light. It is as though the idea of Göbekli Tepe echoed across the world, not through trade or conquest, but through the human mind itself. Wherever people looked up, they saw the same stars and felt the same need to give them meaning. Some researchers call these places the sky temples. They are older than writing, older than cities, yet already show a precision that rivals modern instruments. At Nabta Playa, near the border of ancient Nubia, a circle of megaliths marks the rising of Orion's belt exactly as it appeared 9,000 years ago, almost the same time Göbekli Tepe was built. In South America, the builders of Caral aligned their pyramids with the Milky Way. thousands of years before the Incas. These were not isolated coincidences. They were the same human story repeating in different lands, the urge to build where heaven touches earth. We call them ancient, but in truth, they are us. The same curiosity burns behind their eyes, the same longing to understand the unknown. Each culture looked up and saw its reflection among the stars. And perhaps that is why their monuments last. They are not only structures of stone, but acts of remembrance. Imagine those nights 12,000 years ago, when the fires burned bright against the Anatolian hills. The people of Göbekli Tepe would gather in the circle's center as the sky turned above them. They would point, name, and mark. They would teach their children where each star rose and how it moved with the seasons. Stories would be told of animals that became constellations, of ancestors who walked among the heavens. Each tale carried information: when to hunt, when to gather, when to prepare for winter. But beneath that practicality was something deeper: the recognition that they were part of a vast pattern, that the same order governing the stars governed them. Over generations, those stories hardened into myth. Myth became ritual. Ritual became architecture. The temple was the memory of the sky carved into the earth. As centuries passed and the climate changed, many of these early astronomer priests moved on. The fertile plains around Göbekli Tepe began to dry. The people dispersed, some north toward the Black Sea, others south into Mesopotamia, carrying with them fragments of the old star law. In time, those fragments would resurface in Sumer, where the first zodiac would be carved into clay. The pattern was reborn, but its origin had long since been buried under the hill they left behind. The Sumerians spoke of the Watchers, divine beings who studied the heavens and passed their wisdom to humankind. The Egyptians built their pyramids to mirror the stars of Orion. The Mayans aligned their cities with Venus. Every civilization that rose after carried the same code, an inherited reverence for the sky, a memory that began in a place like Göbekli Tepe. What makes this even more haunting is the precision of their alignments. Modern measurements reveal that the builders of these sites somehow knew the earth itself moved, not only around the sun, but in a slow wobble of its axis, a cycle lasting nearly 26 millennia. This precession caused the stars to drift gradually across the horizon over ages. To have noticed it, they would have needed continuous observation for thousands of years. How could a nomadic people without writing have preserved such long-term knowledge? The answer may lie in story. Before books, story was the archive of civilization. Each generation retold what the previous one has seen, not in numbers or charts, but in myths. A star became a hero, a constellation became a beast, a cycle of light and darkness became a war between gods. When we decode those myths, we find data, planetary motion, eclipses, seasons. The oral traditions that reach Greece, Egypt, and Babylon may have begun in the firelight of Göbekli Tepe, where storytellers memorized the stars not as scientists, but as poets. And when disaster came, when the earth shifted or the skies darkened, those same stories became warnings. A generation that survived catastrophe would pass down its fear through parable: the flood, the serpent, the falling star. By turning memory into myth, they made sure the lesson would last. Long after the reason was forgotten, the story would remain. That is the power of Göbekli Tepe. It is not only a monument of stone, but of mind. It represents the moment humanity began to think beyond survival, to imagine, to remember, to predict. It is where the species looked up and realized that the sky was not chaos but order, and that order could be understood. 12,000 years later, we are still sky watchers. We build telescopes instead of temples, satellites instead of circles. But the impulse is the same. We are still carving our questions into the universe, hoping someone, someday, will find the answers. And perhaps that is why Göbekli Tepe moves us so deeply. It reminds us that we have been asking the same question since the beginning. Who are we in the vastness of the stars? For 12,000 years, the hill lay silent. Rain fell, wind shifted the dust, and generations of shepherds walked above it without knowing what slept beneath their feet. The world changed again and again. Empires rose and fell, languages were born and died, mountains eroded, rivers changed their course. But the stones endured, buried under their own secret. Then, in the late 20th century, a shepherd noticed something strange. A stone edge jutting from the soil, curved, smooth, carved. He thought it might be a grave marker. He was right in a way. It was a marker for a civilization that had buried itself. That discovery brought archaeologists to the hill, and for the first time since the Ice Age, sunlight touched the faces of the pillars. The ground opened like a wound in time, and the past began to breathe again. As the layers were cleared away, the truth emerged piece by piece. An ancient people, nameless and forgotten, had built a place of staggering complexity thousands of years before writing or the wheel. Their tools were stone, their technology was muscle and mind, yet their vision reached the stars. It shattered every timeline, every assumption, every story we told ourselves about progress. The textbooks had to change. But more than that, something in our imagination had to change. Göbekli Tepe forced humanity to confront the possibility that civilization did not begin with us, but with them. People who lived in harmony with nature, who hunted, gathered, and still found time to build cathedrals to the sky. They had no nations, no kings, no armies. And yet, they united for something that transcended survival. That is the part modern eyes struggle to understand. We measure advancement by metal, machines, and power. They measured it by meaning. Their monument was not for control, but for connection, to one another, to the earth, to the cosmos. In their carvings of animals and stars, they declared that they belonged to a greater pattern. In a world of danger and uncertainty, they built permanence out of faith. What drove them to bury it remains one of archaeology's great mysteries. Maybe the changing climate forced them to move on, or perhaps the ritual had ended and the cycle was complete. But there's something poetic in the thought that they didn't destroy it, they preserved it. They trusted that one day someone would find it again. And when we finally did, it arrived like a mirror held up to our own civilization. In a time when we build higher than ever but believe less than ever, Göbekli Tepe reminds us what truly began our story. The need to find meaning in a vast, indifferent universe. It tells us that belief, not technology, was humanity's first invention. Before we built cities, we built symbols. Before we had empires, we had wonder. The builders of Göbekli Tepe vanished, but their work endured long enough for us to rediscover it. And in doing so, they achieved what every civilization hopes for. They were remembered. Their silence became their legacy. They taught us, across 12,000 years, that the human heart has always been the same. We are still the same creatures who look at the stars and ask why. We are still the species that buries its fears in the earth and raises its hopes toward the heavens. As the sun sets over the hill today, its light strikes the stone faces just as it did when mammoths still roamed the plains. The wind hums through the gaps between pillars, carrying voices we can no longer hear. Somewhere in that sound is the oldest message our species ever left behind. We were here, we built this, remember us.